Good evening, everyone. I'm your host, Jason Miles, here for another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you're new to the channel, welcome. So glad to have you here. If you're one of our returning listener subscribers or one of our very valued patrons, so glad to have you back. We usually don't do shows on Mondays, but all of us in the TIR universe, that includes Ben at Give Them an Argument and Derek Varn at Varn Vlog, have, like many of you, been negatively affected by the increased presence of ICE and their domestic occupations of U.S. neighborhoods, terrorizing citizens under the guise of protection. We decided to speak on it collectively. So again, thank you guys so much for taking the time to tune in. Before we bring the panel in, a brief reminder that TIR is a listener-supported endeavor. So if you enjoy and find value in programming such as this, and you'd like to join us for our raucous champagne rooms and movie nights, or you just like to support a media project like this, then become a patron or a paid YouTube subscriber for as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year. You can have access to all of the above, plus the weekly TIR newsletter. Edition 8 is out today. And early access to the Crisis Papers. And the latest edition of the Crisis Papers we'll be discussing this Saturday. But wherever you are watching or later listening to this, there are links in the description to join and make sure TIR can continue to bring you shows like this. Now, on to what you people came here for in the first place. What the hell is going on with all the ICE? Before the 2024 election, our very own deep state Cuba channeled his inner Sith Lord and issued a dark and prescient warning about the future of this country. He argued that if Trump were to secure a second term, the biggest lesson Trump learned from his first stint running a world superpower was this: do not recycle conservative or GOP figures from past administrations. They won't be loyal. Bureaucrats won't be loyal. Therefore, they must be eliminated in the name of efficiency. Cuba predicted an administration filled with sycophants. And that is exactly where we are, with majorities in both the House and the Senate, coupled with a Supreme Court that is Trumpian in nature. Donald Trump has amassed enormous governing capital. He is now using it to eliminate any department or institution that does not declare fealty to Trump as supreme leader. The veil of democracy is gone. What we are witnessing is a power-mad, mildly senile kleptocrat living out a tyrannical revenge fantasy. If the American people end up as collateral damage in the crosshairs, so be it. Trump has been wealthy and disassociated from civilian life since birth. Why would we expect him to care about the people? In the mind of this narcissistic despot, we the people becomes we the people. Trump's ICE operations have functioned less like targeted raids and more like domestic occupations of defiant blue cities. The latest attempt at takeover of Minneapolis, allegedly in search of fraudulent Somalis, who make up roughly about 2% of the city's population, has now escalated to the murder of an American citizen. Kristi Noem, one of Trump's most dedicated MAGA minions, has labeled the victim of the ICE shooting a domestic terrorist, a sharp deviation from the usual law enforcement playbook. Typically, we're told there will be an investigation. This time, DHS is not apologizing. Instead, they are sending a clear message to the American people. We are the enemy in their seek and destroy mission targeting brown communities. Social media is flooded with videos of ICE officers terrorizing brown people and Somali U.S. citizens at their places of work, demanding identification. If individuals state they were born outside the United States, regardless of their legal status, they are arrested first, questioned later. All of this occurs with the blessings of Donald Trump. This is what the end of democratic pretense looks like. Armed agents roaming neighborhoods, civilians labeled terrorists after they're dead, and a federal government daring the public to resist. ICE is not protecting anyone. It is testing how much repression this country will tolerate before people remember what mass resistance actually looks like. And with that, let me bring in the panel, coming all the way live from a secret bunker somewhere hidden in the depths of the cavernous Death Star, Deep State Cuba.
Hello, all my beautiful internet people.
Also, coming all the way live from another secret bunker, this is somewhere in the mountainous western region. Please welcome C. Derek Moore. Coming all the way live from down the street from me is my neighbor and host of Give Them an Argument, Ben Burgess. And another one of the TIR Central Committee members who hasn't been on the show much because he's been so busy being racist. But only to specific types of brown people, not to everyone. Please welcome me, Jean Bajlan.
What's up? How's it going? And also, I have to say, I feel like I was an early adopter on the anti-Indian hate, but now it's like, it's not cool anymore. It's just depressing.
Well, let's start with Cuba, because I know you're not happy with your prognostication of what Trump 2.0 will look like. You wrote an article in Jacobin that people probably didn't like what you had to say. Here we are in 2026, starting off, maybe it's worse, I don't know, than 2025. What is your magic 8 ball telling you now, Cuba?
So, I was, as part of my kind of big intellectual project to try to understand political developments in Europe, historically, the evolution of the United States, I spent a fair amount of time examining how authoritarian and totalitarian governments consolidate their power, and how a society can move from something like the Weimar Republic, which was relatively free, you had competitive elections, a high degree of individual freedom, right? A strong queer movement, to the Third Reich, which is kind of our template for dystopian ethno-nationalist totalitarianism.
Mm-hmm.
And the path always inevitably goes through the security services and the apparatus of government administration. Doesn't matter so much who dominates electorally, or rather, the electoral is just the prelude to the greater struggle, which is taking this apparatus, this staff that executes the directives of any government, democratic, fascist, totalitarian, one-man rule, junta, you name it, and makes it real on the ground. When you have that apparatus staffed by people who are committed to at least the bourgeois democratic niceties, the parable of democracy, if not the substance of it, then you get something like the slow walking, the undermining of MAGA Trumpism that you saw in the first term. Trump learned from that. Steve Miller learned from that. And now you have figures in the MAGA right who are self-consciously emulating some of the tactics of totalitarian societies in creating parallel versions of essential social institutions and ensuring that their people, loyalists, are in positions to lead, especially the security services. And in the United States, that it's been much easier to spin up new agencies that are nominally specialized and limited. Indeed, this was supposed to be a feature of American checks and balances, that rather than having a single domestic federal police that is authorized to investigate everything and anybody, you will have all of these specialized smaller institutions that if any one of them becomes more threatening, then you can shut it down and replace it. But what we've had instead is that precedent abused to spin up new agencies that are directly responsible to the Department of Homeland Security itself, a step in the wrong direction, consolidating a lot of law enforcement functions under a single executive branch agency. Loyal to Trump and staffed by people who have been vetted and selected for fidelity and commitment to this white nationalist vision of what America should be, that type of MAGA. And what's happening now is an attempt to, on the one hand, things are going basically as I predicted in terms of stepping up ICE, other agencies like Customs and Border Patrol, ones that were already fairly right wing and are now, through the pretext of immigration, kind of becoming this domestic, national, coercive force that can investigate pretty much anything and anybody. And we saw that extension of their authority beginning to be justified through this Charlie Kirk assassination, Antifa super soldier, left-wing conspiracy, which attaches American political dissidents to the nominally, purportedly criminal aliens that were supposed to be the targets of ICE and CPB enforcement mechanisms. They're already on a hiring spree. They're trying to staff up these agencies as quickly as possible with people who won't ask questions but carry out orders. And one reason why why Vance, I think, made the total immunity statement, or absolute immunity, whatever, it doesn't exist, but it's also terrifying and a step in the direction of absolute arbitrary authority on the part of these agencies, is to encourage recruitment, right? If you know going in that you're going to have absolute immunity for whatever type of abuse you might contemplate in the course of your duties, then a lot of people who might be anxious that they'll run into legal or professional culpability or abuse and misbehavior now are much more reassured that this really is the place for them. This really is Trump's biker gang. This really is the Christie Nome clan. And this is also dawning on many Americans, including ones that are less terminally online, less obsessed with politics. The optics coming out of Minnesota and other places, especially Minnesota right now, are very dismal for ICE. The confirmation bias and the sort of tribal affinities mean that people who are on board with the MAGA project see nothing wrong, right? Like, why are all of these terrible, awful suburban moms and elderly people being so aggressive and cruel to our innocent ICE officers who are out there fearing for their lives, trembling in their tactical gear? But the rest of the country is coming to terms with the fact that, hey, there is this stormtrooper type organization that's incubating and already operating on American streets. You thought that it was just going to hit the criminal aliens, then it was just going to hit the illegals. But no, it turns out that even middle-class white women can be killed with impunity. So I don't know what happens over the course of this year, because I don't know if the plan will succeed or not, right? There's places where it can still fail. You might trigger a revolt from within what we could call legacy law enforcement at the federal level. The FBI, for instance, has always had a very professional and serious self-image, regardless of what regardless of what the reality of their behavior might be. They consider themselves to be serious protectors of the Constitution and grown-ups above the animal spirits of racist ICE officers. Perhaps they'll intervene, especially since Kash Patel and Don Bongino is out, and Kash Patel does not enjoy a great deal of confidence from rank and file FBI agents. They've been trying to purge these institutions, again, move straight out of a totalitarian playbook and exactly what you should be doing, because you want to prevent them from getting in the way and potentially deposing you. But both the FBI and the military might serve that function. They might intervene at some point when it looks like Trump is going to trigger a serious domestic conflict, and they feel a greater affinity with the protesters and with the opposition than they do with the MAGA program. Then again, maybe the purges have worked, maybe it's gone far enough, and maybe the polarization will break for Trump, as it did in the case of Germany in the 1930s.
Gene Bajlan, welcome back. It's been a while since we've had you back on the show, but it's not like we don't talk on a very frequent basis. I feel like you would know the answer to this question very well, would have some insight here. At what point does federal law enforcement cross the line into military-style domestic occupation? And has ICE already crossed that threshold? Did they cross it when they were kind of created?
I mean, as a non-US citizen, I just have to say I really respect our ICE boys and all the great work they're doing to protect our communities and to keep everybody safe from the dangerous people who are coming into this country. But on the question in an abstract sense, I mean, the American police is quite militarized, even like compared to other parts of the world. Like, I mean, compared to Britain, they have guns and things like that all the time, and they have a lot of tech, high tech stuff. They have a SWAT team. So militarization, I guess, is in the eye of the beholder. The U.S. law enforcement and the various coercive institutions of the state, even those ones with tasked with domestic security, are, you know, very well armed. And if I'm not mistaken, again, I'm not an expert about this, but they became even more well armed due to, the sale of excess military equipment to various law enforcement agencies across the country. So, I don't think ICE is fundamentally, at least in terms of the amount of coercive power they're deploying, is anything particularly out of the ordinary. It wasn't like that lady was killed with like a tank shell or something. She was killed with a gun, right? And that is, that's just the nature of America law enforcement, that it tends to end up with a lot more shootings. Maybe that's to do with, partly to do with law enforcement culture, no doubt, but probably it's also to do with the tremendously violent nature of American society. You have an armed society. You have a society where people go around doing all kinds of, like shootings and things like that, which are just not really seen outside the West, outside the Western world. And a lot of it is just unexpected and random as well. Like I can't remember who I was talking to. I think it was Vaughn I was talking to. Is like, everybody in Kurdistan is armed. They all have like a Kalashnikov, but they keep their violence for a good old fashioned ethnic pogrom, not random acts of violence across the, like the violence that you might see in, let's say, a different part of the world is kind of be expected. It's political, ethnic, or what have you. Here, I mean, I can't imagine being in law enforcement is a particularly fun job, to be honest, in the US. I mean, and it's not particularly fun often to have interactions with them. So you bring into ICE here, you have like a federal agency. I don't know how they're training them, but I'm assuming they're expanding them very quickly. They have far less training. I don't think they're all going to the criminal justice programs at the universities.
No, they have to play an hour and a half of duck hunt.
Yeah, I mean, so you're going to have people who are perhaps not the best trained, don't know exactly the legal things going on at the moment. So I don't know. I mean, one of the interesting things I would say is, in the aftermath, it seems to me, at least in some places, there is increasingly a division between regular law enforcement and this greatly expanded federal agency. And, perhaps some of that is kind of quote unquote political or moral, but some of it's probably just to do with turf battles or the fact that, if these raids and operations aren't executed appropriately, they're going to make it more difficult for law enforcement to do their tasks. So I don't know where any of this is going to go, but it certainly seems that no one's backing down at this point. I just read that they're sending in more ICE agents to Minnesota, and one only has to conclude that this is the federal government is playing hardball with these things and doesn't want to be seen to back down. And that kind of goes back to one of the points that Kuba made, and the lessons from the first Trump administration is that backing down is usually seen as not just a sign of weakness, but usually doesn't just lead to backing down, but leads to retreat. So there's a kind of what do they call it? Auswärtsgang policy. You just keep going. You just keep going, because even if you're perhaps not happy, I mean, like you read things coming out of the Trump administration from time to time, and you read that Trump isn't particularly happy with the performance of this or that minister. The kind of people that they're recruiting are not necessarily the most effective individuals, even from their own perspectives. But doesn't want to give the media a win, doesn't want to give the opposition a win, so they end up maintaining people who perhaps in other circumstances would long since have been removed.
Derek Varn.
So there's a bunch of things when you think about the difference between Weimar Germany and now, and the difference between the claims of the Trump administration and what they are trying to do. And I don't know that these should hearten you or terrify you. One is the Roma, Jews, and queers in the Weimar Republic were less than 3% of the population. Trump's target is about 20% of the population. If you add in all liberal moms and everything else, you're dealing with 60% of the population. We might not like it that it takes a white woman being shot in pretty obvious cold blood to make it obvious to people that a lot of their conservative friends will justify anything, including the oligarchs making apps for deep fake child porn off of real children.
Gross.
That there is no line.
Importing OnlyFans girls and the gambling and everything.
Yeah, there is no line, but I want to talk about some of the natures of the agencies we're dealing with in specific. We are dealing with ICE, but you're also dealing with Border Patrol. It is highly likely from the patches on Ross's shoulder that he was attached to Customs and Border Patrol. ICE is a relatively recent invention. It comes from the Department of Homeland Security at restructuring of the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, moving immigration out of the ATF and into its own department. It's relatively new. Border Patrol is not. But what has changed Border Patrol is Border Patrol over the past, and this actually goes all the way back to the Bush administration, has seen the jurisdiction of the border expanded. What makes that interesting is Border Patrol's modus operandi tends to exist in a place where there are no legal rules. The border is an area where neither national nor international laws completely and totally apply. Now, it's not true that there's no rules there, but there's not many. I've looked up, for example, the number of Border Patrol shootings that involve cars like the one we've seen today. I found at least 70 of them. None of them, not one, has ever been prosecuted. But most of them are on the border itself. Now, there are explicit rules around this. If you look at rules for engagement, precisely the thing of stepping in front of a car is forbidden. It's considered, it nullifies a self-defense claim for a police officer. That's standard operating procedure. It's known law. Now, there's also a couple other things that make this interesting and complicated. The Republicans knew what they were doing when they beefed up ICE and CPB's monetary value. I mean, right now they're if you went by the amount of funding they're getting, they're the 13th largest army on the planet. However, they actually don't have that size of recruits. So what Gene said about how long they're trained for 47 days. They have waived almost every prior requirement, including background checks. HR has been leaking to the public that they're like having breakdowns about this because only about 30% even graduate that paltry 47-day training. Liberals, however, will seize on this as a lack of training for why this has happened. They already have. They also will say things like, "Oh, well, ICE has bigger guns than we do," which is transparently not true. Like many of these police departments are militarized. However, currently in Minnesota, there are more ICE agents in Minneapolis than there are cops, and they are continuing to see more. There have been leaks from Border Patrol that even some Border Patrol higher-ups are worried about the backlash that this will incur. And Border Patrol has been more willing to be the shock troopers of the Trump administration. If you think about what happened in 2020, and this is very specific, when the top brass pretty much told Trump, no, it would not be a good idea to invoke the Insurrection Act, something that has been invoked many times in U.S. history. George Herbert Walker Bruce invoked it during the Rodney King riots. It is not martial law, despite what people think, although it could be used to instantiate something like that, depending. We've also had the courts push back on their deployments of military and whatnot. What I find interesting about that, though, is that in some cases we'd rather have military than Border Patrol and ICE doing this kind of operation, because military is much less likely to do the kinds of things.
They're a little better stress tested.
Yeah, they're extremely better stress tested. And what happened, I've heard several military officers saying what happened today would land you in Leavenworth if it was on a camera. Not that it never happens, but that it would do that.
Because of its long history and its character, the U.S. military has much more robust internal disciplinary measures, especially the Judge Advocate General's Corps. And of course, there's lots of room to criticize, and it's not ideal, but it is more even-handed and more sort of procedurally objective than total immunity, right? And so military officers, regular soldiers that are committing some kind of abuse would typically have to worry about an actual due process being enforced on them over those kinds of actions. But that's missing completely from these federal agencies under DHS. So yeah, Vorm makes a very good point. In some ways, martial law might be more accountable than what we have now.
Yeah. And a quick reminder, like I said, this isn't the first time that basically Trump has used Border Patrol as his ground troops. If you remember back in 2020, when the Insurrection Act was not invoked, who did he go have kidnap people from Portland off the streets? And he released all of them. The Portland justice system couldn't process all of them, but only a few were ever tried. But it was Border Patrol, right? Because they were the only federal agency that would just take orders and were not afraid of internal retaliation. Now, I guess I'm saying, because like Kuba, I think we're in a very bad place. The questions that we have to ask ourselves is, there are other things we should be looking at on the seizures here. A lot of people, it's like he's clearly trying to invoke something to freeze elections. The thing is, federal government can't freeze elections. Cannot freeze elections. What would probably happen if that was attempted would be more open clashes between state and federal officials with potential like gun holdoffs and whatnot. They're already threatening lawsuits over what Trump is trying to do with seizing voter ballots to figure out who to purge or not. So that's all in play. And I want to put this in the context too, and I'll turn it over to Ben or whoever. About what this means, because a lot of people are like, oh, we don't have a very unified government anymore. We don't. That's one thing that Doge has made sure of. These other things have made sure of. But we have seen that liberals are cowards. When they, when Walz invoked the National Guard to say protect people from ICE, mostly what he's done is just keep physical barriers between ICE and
protesters.
What he has not done is stop things that are blatantly unconstitutional under the Fourth Amendment, which is house-to-house roundups. Now, I know every chud thinks they're a specialist on the law right now, and in a way that I think when this is all over, if Democrats come to power, they won't do this, but they should. They should be invoking Article 3, Section 3, and if you don't know what that is, look it up. But they're not going to do that. But nonetheless, I think we have to be very serious about the fact that, like, there's also a full assault on all other power. Trump either thinks his legislative time are numbered, and I want to put this in. All this stuff happened, even the Maduro thing, a day after they got down to holding the House by one vote. They currently, even before the election, now hold the House by one vote. And he's got clear defectors in both the House and the Senate. They've already voted to limit to say that anything that he does in Venezuela beyond this point does not have congressional authorization. That should be a bigger deal than it is. They have passed ACA subsidies that he's probably going to have to revoke if it gets through the Senate. But that means there's 17 GOP defectors there too. The economy is only going to get worse. And this is the kind of thing that's going to make it worse. He is attempting to intimidate Jerome Powell, who I know liberals are going to celebrate him as a hero because they celebrate everyone that writes as a hero. Jerome Powell is no hero. I want to be very clear on that. He is a boring bureaucrat whose job as a bureaucrat is to kind of suppress a lot of things that would be good for working people. But I can promise you don't want to collapse the US dollar, even if you're a worker. So you have that. You have this mask off moment with, I mean, it looks like a Groyper is literally running the DHS Twitter accounts because every third thing is a literal fascism reference. There is a reference to One of Us, All of Yours, which is a reference to killing every male citizen of a Czechoslovakian town in World War II in response to the death of what?
Reinhard Heydrich.
Yep. You have an invocation with we can come home. That's an explicit neo-Nazi song. And I hate to tell you this, that Trump is probably the more multiracial of where this has gone, because you have a condensation effect, or maybe what we might call a reduction effect, down with young GOP. If you looked at the numbers, last year we were talking about this emergent GOP. This year it's already wiped out. People are fleeing from it like crazy. But who does that leave?
That's a scary thing.
Right? It leaves a bunch of people who grew up on Pepe memes and alt-right shit, who are explicit white nationalists, being signaled to, not by Trump, but by J.D. Vance, that this is going to be okay. Now, I don't know that J.D. Vance would actually follow through with that, because I don't know that J.D. Vance believes a goddamn thing anyway. I mean, the man was a never Trumper who called Trump a fascist in 2016, 2017. So, I mean, you know.
Anyone who calls that kid Vivek, I really doubt their sincere commitment to the continuation of the right ways.
Well,
Right.
Well, Ben, I want to ask you. Jacob Fry made a very impassioned speech, and he even used 4-letter words in it. That he wanted ICE the F out of Minneapolis. But we've still been seeing this ICE paramilitary terrorizing people, and not the people they've been sent to allegedly capture, but people that are following ICE and videotaping ICE. When are we going to see ICE arrests for what Philadelphia came out and said some stern words about how they're going to prosecute ICE? When are we going to see ICE get prosecuted for something besides sex trafficking and being drunk and arrogant?
Yeah, I don't know. So apparently I lack Kuba's Sith Lord powers of prediction, which, speaking of which, I don't know what the fuck I did to you, but that's yeah. Article you're talking about, two people wrote that.
I didn't say your name too?
No, you did not.
Oh wow, sorry. That was mean. Kuba and Ben wrote it. I'm sorry.
Every time you brought it up,
oh damn, yeah, my bad.
Hurt Ben's feelings for no reason.
Damn, I'm over here just sorry. I'm the douchey friend.
But in any case, yeah, in that, and I should say, right, because the question about the analogies to Weimar Germany and all that, came up, and I still think, right, I mean, I don't know if Kuba himself even agrees with this, but I still think that what we wrote in 2024 still seems right to me. Right. So what we said in that article on this very subject was, in 2016, many progressives believed that Trump represented an imminent fascist threat to the very existence of American democracy. His first term seemed to reveal this as baseless hysteria. We go into some details. Then we ask, does this mean, though, that the MAGA dystopia will never arrive? Let's take it as a given that a classic police state where all opposition parties and labor unions are banned, i.e. actual fascism, is off the table, that analogies to German and Italian history don't shed much light on these questions. Nevertheless, Trump making the American state significantly uglier and more authoritarian than it is remains a distinct possibility. And that combination seems exactly right to me. I think that the sort of historical circumstances that gave rise to fascism are just radically different, right, than anything that's true right now. And I do worry that overstating those analogies, can minimize the sense that, as grim as this is, right, that this is something that can be and very likely can be, right, not inevitably, right. I mean, this could get much worse, and I want to talk about that in a second, but that can actually still be beaten back by means of normal politics. That it is, in other words, like, I think if you believed that full on 1930s fascism was already here, I don't think we would all be having this conversation using our real names. When most of the people on the screen continue to live in the United States, right? But that doesn't mean that American democracy is a-okay, and that and that significant Democratic backsliding isn't potentially on the agenda. I think it's absolutely potentially on the agenda. In fact, I think quite a bit of it has already happened. I would push back a little bit, and this does connect to your question. I mean, the boring answer to your question is I don't know, and nobody else does either. I'm not optimistic, but things have been so strange, and so many unexpected things have happened that I wouldn't rule it out. Right, that we actually could see a pivot happen where it gets so bad that you actually do start to get local law enforcement putting ICE agents behind bars. In fact, I think there was, I think that there was that might very well have happened with the murder of Renee Good if the Trump administration hadn't effectively obstructed local investigation. But I do want to push back on Gene a little bit in terms of the comparison to normal American policing, because it is true, of course, that American policing is really militarized. It has been for a long time, compared to a lot of other parts of the world. In fact, in some ways, I mean, that's like, there were times in the past when it was even more militarized than it is now, right? The sort of classic LAPD sending tanks to crack houses era. But it is true, right, that the baseline of American policing is really militarized compared to lots of the rest of the world. But I don't think that means it's true that ICE is sort of no more militarization of law enforcement than usual. I think it's a huge militarization of law enforcement. And I think if you compare ICE to normal, to normal American police departments, I think one really significant difference is that normal local cops don't generally wear masks. They in most contexts, right? They don't. In fact, oftentimes they have to give you their name and badge number.
It's kind of antithetical to their job as neighborhood police officers, right? They're supposed to be people within the community, as it's supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are police departments where you literally have to wear a name tag, right? That says what your name is. Whereas in this case, you had the Vice President of the United States waxing indignant that Ross had been doxxed by a journalist saying what his name was, right? Which is a complaint.
Exactly. As though there were some expectation of privacy when you kill someone.
Exactly. Or even just privacy when you're enforcing the law, right? I mean, like privacy when you're enforcing the law, a different, pithier way to say that would be secret police, right? Which is something that democracies aren't supposed to have.
What happened?
And I would point that out. I would point that out too, that every totalitarian and repressive state has both regular police forces, right? I think that we can agree that ICE, CPB, this complex of federal agencies that Trump is using to go after activists, go after, of course, immigrants and communities of color all across the United States, but especially in blue cities, that is not the same as local police. That there is a clear dividing line between these two organizations, whatever issues you may have with both of them. Even in countries like the Third Reich, even in the Soviet Union, even in communist Poland, everywhere where there is a totalitarian repressive system of power, you have a specialized agency that does the political repression that is distinct from criminal police. And even the German police in 1939 were not the Gestapo, right? In Poland, you had, after World War II, you had specialized agencies stood up by the Communist Party in order to effect political repression. So these guys really are something new and something different, a step, if not already there, towards that secret police.
And I just want to point out, right? It's like I think, Jason asked earlier, okay, when did it cross that line? And in some ways, when it was created, I mean, remember, ICE is very recent, right? I mean, that's in the grand scheme of like American law enforcement agencies. It came about day after yesterday. It was part of the War on Terror reorganization of the federal government, and it was created as a much more aggressive and militarized replacement for the INS, which is what we had before to enforce immigration laws, do raids, all of that stuff. And itself, that builds on a lot of changes that the big dog Bill Clinton did in the 1990s to make American immigration enforcement a lot harsher. So instead of just rounding people up and then busing them across the border and dropping them off without filing any paperwork, you had this whole parallel legal system and all that. But I also think that sometimes leftists are prone to, in their eagerness to emphasize that they understand that things have always been really bad, I think sometimes we're prone to sort of minimize or poo-poo or even be in denial about the obvious ways that things get worse, because, it's like this gargantuan massive expansion of ICE last year, so it's like bigger than the wartime Russian military, right? This isn't just business as usual. This is a new thing, and it's very much part of an attempt to it's very much part of an attempt to impose a level of authoritarianism that we certainly haven't seen in recent American history. I mean, I think that's just kind of a baseline for like any sane description of this.
Gene Bajlan.
I mean, I wouldn't say it's not an escalation, but it's something that has been kind of on the cards for a while. When the foundations and particularly the foundations of this kind of more securitized internal system in the United States emerged during the war on terror. Of course, when Obama came to power, a lot of it was codified. ICE was kind of grown under Obama. And of course, we've had this militarization. So I'm not trying to say that there's no difference or things aren't potentially getting worse and things like that. Obviously, it's quite concerning to see these things happening in this country. But it just feels like we've been kind of in the what's the metaphor? You're in the frog in the thing, frog in boiling the frog, right? We've been boiling the frog for a while, and now it seems we've got to the point where we kind of realize, damn, it's hot in there, right?
But what if it gets comfortable?
I don't know.
Because
it seems here. A lot of conservatives I know
are quite comfortable.
There's a lot of people that are quite that don't vote. They don't know what's going on. How dangerous?
What's going to matter for them is the economy, because all this is all connected. They're kind of spinning out of this administration, and as Kuba indicated earlier, it's not just going to affect anything. Varn indicated too. The economy is going to get worse, and ultimately, that's what's putting pressure on the government. If the economy is 2019 economy now, people would not be as angry about this.
I mean, look at Trump the other day saying we're going to investigate these anti-ICE protests and who is funding them, and he said, "Oh, because they've got these new signs." It's like Trump thinks the economy is so bad people can't afford to protest.
Well, I started off the weekly newsletter with a quote that I heard today on the news, which is, "We had whistles and they had guns." So there is a huge difference between who's funding who. How dangerous is Trump's insistence on loyalty over institutional competence? And what historical parallels should we be paying attention to? Or are we in a new moment right now?
That's always a difficult one. I just want to jump in quickly because it bites both ways, because loyalty strengthens you in certain ways, but loyalty also means you sometimes hire some people who aren't very good at their job, which undermines your project at the same time. So it comes down to like, who are you managing to get loyal to you, and are they pretty effective? And some of these people don't seem to be pretty effective at their jobs.
Fine.
So I am going to talk about a book I always talk about, but there's a whole chapter in it on this kind of thing, which is Collapse of Complex Civilizations. And I'm going to tie it into the economy because I don't think this is going to go away with Trump. Loyalty tests have been increasing. They're more sophisticated on the Democratic side, but they are there. 2, the systems that exist that fragment, and this is one way where we are different from Weimar. Weimar was a new state. effectively. It came out of the burning ashes of another new state. I need to remind people that Germany had not been unified all that long before World War I happened, and Weimar is a republic that emerged after the revolution failed in Germany, and it didn't last very long. So you had two states that had like a length of 2 generations and a generation. That is not the case here. What we do see is increasingly people are competent in super specialized areas and people are under socialized. With under socialization, it means that they tend to identify and project upon all kinds of things parasocially, particularly leaders, because it makes their pathetic, sad lives seem a little bit better. I think that's why you see a lot of loyalty. You see, is it dangerous? Absolutely. But the problem that you're going to have is it's also incompetent. We've already seen this throughout Trump too. Not only is it incompetent, it is carving out all competence that it can to get rid of its competition. And historically speaking, these things happen in societies that then go through either some kind of major formative change that redoes everything. If you think about the period between after the revolution in France, where you have Louis Philippe and then Bonaparte III, you go through many kinds of governments in these kinds of periods. America, weirdly, has had this all happen subtly in its history. We haven't had it happen formally. It's been informal. There's been informal restructurings in my manner about 5 or 6 times in our history. The only one that was a big explosive one was the one that led to the Civil War. And I hate to tell you this, but in addition to authoritarian takeover, because of the size of our country, because of the militarization of our country, the danger here is also that something that happens triggers a state to do something that triggers Texas versus White, which is a 1854 law that means that if you do certain kinds of things that are seen as an act of insurrection or succession, that you automatically have your legislature invalidated, and then that in and of itself is and your legislature is considered criminal. And that in and of itself is an act of war internally. And that wasn't the kind of legal framework, and there's no history for that in the German scenario. It gives a different kind of state. So as things become more incompetent on all levels, you're likely to that's just more likely to become a thing. The courts are literally trying to maintain all this right now. In the past week, just to remind you that this assault isn't just with ICE and Border Patrol. They 2 whole departments tried to deny Minnesota every bit of funding off of some fraud allegations. There's nothing like that in U.S. history where the Department of Agriculture is saying we're going to withhold all funds, because the natural response to that would normally be the state withhold federal taxes. That would trigger Texas versus Wright. Almost certainly. And then bets are off. This is why everyone who's like, oh, we'll just have a soft reset and break apart. You don't understand you're like, don't know U.S. law. That does not happen if anyone's still going to try to enforce U.S. law. Or it means that U.S. law is unenforceable. In which case, it's a de facto thing that's already happened. So, yeah, there's a lot of danger here. What is also crazy to me, though, if you're thinking about this in terms of the larger apparatuses, we have this going on while we have where we are threatening a military action that would put us in shooting distance of 6 NATO countries opposing us, including the UK and Iceland, that would immediately dissolve NATO, that would lead to NATO trying to seize, they've made this very clear, U.S. bases. You have this at a time where Trump has threatened and has warships out in front of Cuba, although apparently things have calmed down with Steinbaum, because he's apparently letting Steinbaum send oil to Cuba and backing down on that threat. So who knows? You have this at a time where he's going after the Fed and destabilizing the dollar, which this is another difference between the Nazis and Trump. The Nazis didn't cause the hyperinflation. They ended it. So I have no idea, but I can tell you, if you try to keep a big picture structural view of things, none of us can know what's going to happen now. But all these people who've been telling us, all these lefties have like, nothing ever happens, nothing ever happens, nothing ever happens. Frankly, they need to shut the fuck up. Something is happening.
Ben, would you like to speak up and not shut the fuck up?
Oh, I never shut up. Just ask my ex-wife. Okay, so let me. And it's kind of funny, by the way. I just found out that Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times today quoted an old article that Danny Bessner and I wrote about the fascism question.
Jesus.
Well, some say like leftists, Daniel Bessner and Ben Burgess. But yeah, I mean, I guess. I wanted to say a couple things, and in some ways kind of go back to the back and forth Gene about the escalation, what's new and what's not new, because clearly there's a lot that's not new, and I think it is actually really important to remind people that the foundations for this were laid in the Bush administration. That after 9/11, Bush punched the terrorism hole in the Constitution.
Yeah.
And the Obama administration expanded the whole bit. And of course, I think anybody who with half a brain should see that like punching the terrorism hole in the Constitution meant that some future authoritarian leader could use this to label all sorts of things as terrorism, right? That we have this law-free zone where we call things terrorism and we do whatever we want. What else could we do with this? Which of course is what you get with the narco-terrorism nonsense about Venezuela, with Trump and Vance calling Renee Good a domestic terrorist, et cetera, et cetera. So I think both are true, right? That the foundations were laid much earlier, and also, right, this is a massive and very disturbing escalation of that. And I just wanted to say two things about the sort of fascism of it all, right? The sort of analogies to Germany and all of that, and then how much of a crisis this is, right? Because I saw somebody in the chat. I think Strom in the chat said that Trump was Hindenburg, not Hitler, and I don't think he's either one, right? I mean, he's somebody who exists under dramatically different historical circumstances, and I just don't find either of those analogies super helpful. That trying to like mix and match Trump with these figures who arose for completely different reasons and played completely different roles in completely different circumstances. But I do also think it's important not to overstate the Third Reich analogy, just because like I do think we can still stop this, right? I don't think we're at the point of we might get there. I'm definitely not denying that, right? But I don't think we're at the point yet where it's like, what's the Billy Wilder quote about leaving, Germany, right? That he was asked why, he was so pessimistic about everything all the time. He said, where I come from, the optimists went to Auschwitz and the pessimists ended up with pools in Beverly Hills. I don't think that we're there, and I think it's important that we're not there. I actually do think that mass politics can turn this back. It's really important to turn this back. But I also just want to say, I do think it's really, really, really important to turn this back. And I think just because it's not the Third Reich doesn't mean, like if you don't have brain cancer, that's good news. But that doesn't mean that whatever you do have won't kill you. And even if it doesn't kill you, it doesn't mean that it's not going to hobble you physically horribly. I mean, certainly if you look at, if we expand our range of historical references past interwar Europe, and look at the long history of like right-wing authoritarianism in Latin America, You have all sorts of situations where it's like, yeah, look, is it the gold standard of right-wing authoritarianism with the Third Reich? No, nobody's, being turned into a bar of soap in an industrialized death camp. But lots of leftists and union organizers being quietly disappeared and chopped up into little pieces by death squads, even as some others continue to get away with, with doing what they're doing more or less openly. And you live in a situation where that that's something that might happen to you. And I do think it's really important that we stop the United States from backsliding to the point where we're there. And I do think we could absolutely get there. I mean, generally speaking, I was joking the other day, I think, just baseline, basic ass bourgeois democracy is horribly inadequate in a lot of ways, but we're all going to miss it if it goes away.
Sadly true. Kuba, what does the Minneapolis operation and the killing of American citizens tell us about how ICE views civilian populations, especially in blue cities? And I also want to add that an off-duty ICE officer also killed someone in California.
I think this ties into a few of the other topics that we mentioned so far. And in terms of a historical parallel, one that may be more appropriate to the United States than our comparisons with Germany. In some ways, these ICE operations seem to me like a MAGA reconstruction along white supremacist lines of targeting blue cities, and ultimately with the goal of flipping states. Right? I think that it's not at all a coincidence that these ICE operations are predominantly happening in states with democratic governments and with large voting populations that favor the Democrats. State like Minnesota as well. If you can somehow neutralize or depress the voting population within the Twin Cities, then the countryside might give you enough MAGA votes to tip it into the Republican column, possibly, depending on how effective you are at turning out your people and how effective you are at suppressing the urban population there. I mean urban in the dictionary definition, not as a euphemism. And we've talked about militarization of police, and apart from tactics, equipment, and methods, it's worth discussing what that does to the mentality of officers that are nominally there to serve and protect, right? The government, Trump, Vance, Kristi Noem, all invoked the notion of protecting Americans whenever there's an issue with ICE operations or the operations of federal law enforcement. And the irony is that these are Americans getting killed. These are Americans being beaten. These are Americans being dragged by police vehicles. They're Americans being thrown into detention centers. These are Americans whose most American rights to protest, the things that you would associate with the very founding of the country and the American Revolution, are being broken and abused by these officers in the name of protecting America. So I think that one development that has occurred while all of us were watching and will be very difficult to undo is the polarization of the United States into camps which do not recognize a civic unity with one another. And this has been cultivated within law enforcement through all of the training programs and modules that encourage a warrior mentality, that deliberately compare the duties, the operations associated with occupying Fallujah to the ones around policing Minneapolis or Philadelphia, that draw a straight line between foreign insurgents, between an occupied population and the citizenry that police and these federal law enforcement agencies are supposed to serve and protect. And that's possible only when that bond of national solidarity, of civic unity, has broken down to the point where really it doesn't matter what Renee Good was doing. She was the wrong kind of American. So we got her now, so it'll save us a bullet down the line. And I think that looking at the type of content that ICE produces for itself, the type of advertising and the systems of for recruiting ICE agents, which include geo-targeting ads at gun shows, NASCAR rallies, targeting the viewers of certain podcasts, right? The goal is to raise a force that can be depended on to use lethal violence against other Americans based on differences in political beliefs. Political militia, right? Hezbollah, but for MAGA. And I think that looking at what my favorite right-wing psycho Rod Dreher has been saying for years, you can see the groundwork being laid for this. Certain groups are takfirt, right? Like excluded from the American community, the American cultural space by dint of their identity or their values or often like their attitudes towards sex and gender. And once that happens, right, once you have the de facto mission of an agency that has the authority and the protection to use lethal violence without oversight, then it is difficult to see how you have the choices between anything other than submission and repression or pogroms, uprisings, and violence.
Gene Bajlan?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Cooper is saying. Throughout history, the national projects or nations, they're never a completed project. They're always going through a formulation and reformulation of who is in and out of the group. Obviously, the United States in particular was founded at least, ideologically on a kind of universalist notion of a sovereign people, even though in a practical sense, obviously women and black people were excluded from that project, but they were able to claim on the very ideology of the state to make claims to membership of the nation. And that question was kind of settled through first the Civil War and then again through the Civil Rights Movement. Now, what we're seeing here, and it's kind of interesting to listen to the discourse taking place at the moment, particularly within the Republican Party. So you have people like Vivek Ramaswamy, you have Ben Shapiro talking about the United States as a creedal nation, emphasizing, kind of the political identity. And then you have J.D. Vance explicitly saying, like, oh, well, not everybody who agrees with the founding ideology of the American Revolution can be an American. It's kind of like a dishonest framing, but interesting that he puts it forward. You have this whole the kind of appearance or perhaps reappearance. I'm not so familiar with American political discourse and history of this notion of a heritage American. And obviously, when someone mentions heritage Americans, like somebody who is dark-skinned Latino could be more heritage than whose family has lived in California since the late 18th century is technically more heritage American than a early 20th century German immigrant. But there is there's an image that comes to mind. There is increasingly overt discussion of racial and religious lines defining what it is to be an American. And John Hutchison, who's a sociologist of nationalism, who I had the good fortune to work with when I was an undergraduate. He's retired now, but one of his later books that he wrote was about how often we think of national conflicts as taking place between nations, but often we have this battle within particular national communities over what it means to be part of the nation, what mythologies are kind of brought forth as the central narrative of our national history. What cultural artifacts define the boundary between who is and who is not a member of the nation. Are members of the nation imagined as being, part of this organic collective community, or is it seen as a civic voluntaristic community as well? And so, what's happening here, particularly between, I think, Republicans and Democrats, is, speaking to what Kuba said, is that are two very different visions of what the United States is and should be. And even within the Republican Party, there is a struggle taking place between groups that emphasize perhaps more white identitarian ideology, those who are more oriented around, Christian nationalism, as well as those who kind of draw on the, at least theoretically, on the sort of civic values of the American Revolution. And, in a sense, it is a symptom of the country's national degeneration. And that is playing out in very concrete ways where certain, people inhabit almost completely different worlds. And you can show two people exactly the same video, and they will come away with diametrically opposed interpretations of what's happening.
Derek Varn.
So one thing to think about when you think about American identity, though, is these fractures come up pretty quickly. The religious identity is explicitly WASP, although it's led by Catholics. But you've seen Protestant and Catholic tension and Protestant and Mormon tension really break out. There's been multiple shootings this year that have involved LDS churches, for example. Last year, and one happened in the city this year. It is unclear if it was related to creed or not. A reminder to people, though, we talk about this. The Taiping Rebellion is probably one of the most bloody conflicts within a nation in history. It involved the death of around 20 to 30 million people. The people that would be excluded from MAGA would be more like 100 million people. I hate to tell the white nationalists this, but basically at that point the nation falls apart anyway. Now I don't think we're anywhere near there. But there's a certain group of young nihilist Republicans who this is their ideology now. Even the old alt-rightist of 2012 to 2016 have been alienated by them. And we also see not just in, the right in America is highly fragmented. I know right now it doesn't seem that way because there's blood in the water and people swarm to blood. But just 2 weeks ago, we were seeing the right wing peel off of each other. And we're already seeing more and more pushback in Congress too. I don't want people to feel like anything's automatically good. A lot of people have a very facile understanding of the law, but right now, a lot of those people are also in government. And, Trump is still existing because of that gift given to him by the Supreme Court of executive immunity that we never heard of before. To where, the man can have 4 times the injunctions of any president on the planet. Not on the planet, in the United States, in history. We don't have a president who's had as many legal injunctions against him. And one of the things I think about though is Trump is 80 years old. He's 79. He's about to be 80 years old. His health does not look as good as it once was. Part of what seems to be speeding this up is the election. Part of what seems to be speeding this up is his age. But you could very much see Trump, interestingly, being succeeded by someone like Vance or Marco Rubio who would have like a Khrushchev-Beria fight with each other, for those of you who know your Russian history. And then throwing Trump under the bus, doing kind of like a secret speech thing about this, but then actually pushing an even more explicit right nationalist agenda later on. Or maybe not. The thing is, the right is fragmenting too. That's part of why things feel so much more desperate than them. Remember that a wounded bear lashes out in all directions and will maul you in a way that a more secure bear will not. And I don't know what to tell people to feel of that. People asking, what do we do? How do we fight? I mean, there's a variety of tactics you can do. The one thing I could tell you not to do is throw yourself willy-nilly into an ICE van with a Border Patrol agent by getting in a fight with one and either getting yourself shot or beat up and left on the side of the road, which has also happened. I mean, hell, in Portland, the two people they shot, which was part of an agent, they were just left there. They were alive. They weren't arrested. They were just left there. We're going to have to, even if we do see Democrats come back there, you're going to have to scare them into doing something, because doing something is the one thing politicians don't want to do, right? Because it risks their campaign. Doing nothing is far easier for them politically than doing something. People who do nothing get to have long congressional careers. And you're going to have to do that in a variety of ways. The other thing I'm going to tell you that maybe make people feel comfortable or uncomfortable is maybe leftists need to not be joining silly gun clubs, but maybe thinking about the kinds of organizations that have kept rightists together, including militias. And I don't know, what that means for most people. I don't know how you guys take it when I talk about that, but it's just something that I've been surprised at. Like, you got, for groups that talk about revolution, you guys don't ever join the army. And the other thing you have to think about in all this, though, is if they're really serious, the most likely outcome, if they really try to purge a third of the population, is that the nation collapses. And I keep on reframing this, reframing this in terms of everything else. But you got a crisis in the dollar. You got a crisis in investment. You got a crisis in employment. You have large swaths of unemployed, particularly men, but everybody. You got a crisis with young people not having families. You have an entire social reproduction crisis in a way that makes it look like, even if this wasn't the case, this society doesn't have that much of a future if things stay the way they are. And so you're going to see a lot of stuff thrown against the wall, and I'm going to let other people talk.
Ben?
Yeah, so I do just want to briefly say on the tactical question, I think that it is worth noting that whereas I do know of zero examples of well-established states in the developed world being overthrown by successful civil wars, I do know of a lot of examples of even well-established authoritarian regimes being brought down basically by mass protest and mass noncompliance, and stuff like soldiers refusing to fire on protesters. And I think that's even more true when you do have some democratic institutions, but you're in some stage of nascent authoritarianism and democratic backsliding. But I did just want to go back to the issue that Gene first raised and and that Varn was talking about the Heritage Americans thing, because I think that this is, I mean, this goes back from a different angle to the thing about bourgeois democracy, because obviously, look, I don't love any kind of nationalism. I would vastly prefer to live in some sort of like, borderless global socialism a la Star Trek, right? That would be my first choice by a mile. But I also think that it might take a while to get there, right? From where we are in the world right now. And every actually existing nationalism in the world is somewhere on a spectrum from pure ethno-nationalism to pure civic nationalism. The pure ethno-nationalism, where the nation, right, is supposed to be some sort of ethno-cultural, ancestral, kind of unit. The folk, and might include members of that unit, who don't even live there, and can definitely not include members of the unit who live there. Like, Zionism is a very pure form of ethno-nationalism, but even lots of much nicer places than Israel, that's basically what they've got, right? That the sort of like their like whatever kind of dominant nationalism they have is pretty ethno-nationalism, even if they're reasonably nice to local minorities. Those minorities, never lose sight of the fact that they're basically like well-treated guests, right? Because they're not part of the nation. And I think it's, I don't know. Some of the writing I was happiest about last year, I did for both Jacobin, for the Comrades, and Unheard, in an attempt to preach to the Gentiles in their own tongue, was about this question, as far as like the Trump administration's assault on birthright citizenship and the revival of, the birth. I think it's like new terminology, although I might be wrong about that, of the Heritage American nonsense, and J.D. Vance playing into the Heritage American nonsense, a little bit of a muted way, but it was like pretty clear what he was saying, and what a disaster that is, because like one of the things, like if you're going to be like happy or proud about something about the United States, and I know like a lot of people watching don't want to be, because their whole identity is wrapped up in they sorry dad, I'm a communist sense, that they want to identify themselves as being separate from that. But if you are going to be happy or proud about anything about the United States, like one of the genuinely distinctive and good things about the United States compared to most other countries in the world is that, to a very remarkable extent, right, historically, it's managed to separate national identity from ethnicity. That it's the fact that we have birthright citizenship, the fact that as much as it comes out of a horrific history of settler colonialism and all of that, the end result was that you had people from who could trace their ancestral roots to so many different places that it was hard to attach American identity to anything but the sort of founding democratic institutions. And also, as Varn points out, right, it's those institutions in some form have existed for a very long time, which helps a lot with this, right? Like, France, their first republic started just after ours did, and they're on their fifth, right, I think, republic right now. They had a reversion to monarchy for a little while in there. They had an empire for a little while in there, in between the First Republic and the reversion to monarchy. They had fascism for a little while in the 1940s, and the sort of sense of French identity persisting through that almost had to be tied to this larger ethno-cultural thing. Whereas, because we're still in our first, we could have a sense of American identity that was, tied to those Republican institutions, and even any sort of remaining like connection between like American identity and even a sort of generic white or European American identity was really undermined by the world historic victories of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and the removal of racist immigration quotas in the 60s. None of this is to deny, obviously, the horrific history of racism in the United States. But I do think it's like a civilizational achievement. I think, I think sort of liberal civil nationalism is so much better than the alternative. Not as good as Star Trek Global Socialism, but so much better than the ethno-nationalist alternative. That I think that it's like certainly the thing about Trump round true that I find the most viscerally horrifying, right? That this sort of, the Department of Homeland Security, or no, sorry, the Department of Labor. I always get them mixed up because those are the two government departments that feel like their Twitter accounts are run by teenage groypers, right? The Department of Labor the other day, posted this thing that was like, America, this is who we are, one people, one heritage. And they had this like very creepy Nazi aesthetics kind of video. The Department of Homeland Security Twitter account. I remember last year, they put out a call for people to join ICE, with like the recruitment URL that said "defend your culture." Right? Notice, not enforce the laws, but defend your culture. Make sure that there aren't too many Mexicans. And this is again where I really want socialists and radicals, to get a little bit more excited about why liberal democracy, as grotesquely inadequate as it is, and as much as we want to push through it and push beyond it, to something better, is a immensely important starting point, and it is going to be god awful if we lose it.
Jean Bajlan. Oh, I'm sorry, Kuba. Did you want to respond? Sorry.
Yes, the Ben. I appreciate the civicalism and an appreciation for the particular innovations that came out of the American political experiment, moving away from nationalist views on inclusion. But a lot of that, I would point out, has to do with the fact that there is historically some places where the United States is a little exceptional. It's out of step with the development of other countries. First of all, its origins as a colonial project of another nation. The fact that the United States is not unique in language or culture or religion. If you look at Ethiopia, for instance, you have a distinctive religious tradition, or Armenia is an even better example, because there the ethnos and the religious tradition map onto one another almost perfectly. You have, if you have linguistic barriers dividing your population, then that can serve, then that really does create real challenges in producing unifying identities. The fact that the United States basically has a commercial off-the-shelf language that it got from the British Empire, the fact that there is no American ethnicity that could be an analog to sort of being Irish or French or Japanese, that matters in the way that the United States developed.
It came about for a lot of bad reasons and through a lot of bad history with colonialism and everything. But it is a really good thing. It is an achievement that nobody says I'm a quarter American. That would sound like a category mistake.
Yes. However, they're trying to introduce that because there's always been two sides of the American coin when it came to Republican inclusion. Let's say, I think that we could all agree is pretty laudable. It makes an immigrant society possible. It paves the way for the hope one day of multinational, multiracial, universal coexistence. But the flip side of that was this vulgarized form of ethno-nationalism that is white supremacy, right? Say what you will about Japanese ethno-nationalism or Lithuanian ethno-nationalism. There is only one Japan. There is only one Lithuania. There's only one population that speaks that language. There is only one place where these cultures have experienced historical continuity. There really is a homeland for them in that sense. When I think about people trying to promote white nationalism, well, I ask, what's the white language? What's the white culture? What white culture are you preserving? What are you even talking about here, right? The United States speaks a language that is in no possible universe under threat. It is practically the global lingua franca, and much better countries than the United States speak that language, from New Zealand to Tonga, right? What is white culture, right? Half it's been ransacked from minority groups, right? If you look at Kid Rock as the bard of the white American soul, he's just a white guy performing black music. Similarly, comparing white American nationalism, which is this J.D. Vance style revival of the racialized white supremacy of the 19th century and the early 20th century, then it is difficult to see that as reaching even the lowest levels, right, of actual cultural preservation. Sure, green bean casserole and bland flavored food, that's about as good a metaphor as I can come up with, so I'll end it there.
Jean Bajlan, if ICE continues to operate with impunity, what does that mean moving forward for America?
Or not?
Well, I don't know. Means a lot more people are going to get deported, I guess.
They're not deporting them, though. I mean, that's the thing. They're not deporting them. They're keeping them in camps.
I mean, some people are getting sent to CCOT and Uganda.
Just all kinds of little compounds you don't know about. I mean, like,
Sure.
like the actual
warehousing people is a big money making industry.
Yeah.
So I guess they're gonna keep warehousing and deporting people.
They have deported a lot of people, but they're not even up to second year Biden levels still, despite all of this. Go ahead.
I'm curious if what we'll see as ICE begins to move towards acting against, right, like domestic terrorists and the Antifa insurgency, you won't see people detained, U.S. citizens detained for longer, and the beginning of torture to extract intelligence. Because if they feel it, whether or not there's any basis to believe that there exists an organized effort to undermine the ability of ICE to transform the country in this MAGA imagination, then they'll begin to want names. They'll begin to take counterintelligence measures rather than just this street level, you're in my face, you get the bat behavior that we're seeing. Right? I'm a little concerned about what happens when ICE is old enough, or Customs and Border Patrol, right? This archipelago of American federal law enforcement agencies, when they mature to the point where they begin to have intelligence capabilities and more sophisticated internal mechanisms and organizations. We talked a little about this in terms of the Border Patrol tactic, BORTAC, right? The fact that we're already seeing a worst of the worst emerging in specialized units that are unusually brutal and lawless.
I think right now we're seeing them outsource that they're outsourcing that to Palantir. And I mean, that's who's providing the ability for them to, like, I don't know, come to your house, cut off your cell phone, cut off your Wi-Fi immediately without damaging the infrastructure, which they are definitely doing.
And the co-founder of Palantir said last week on Twitter that the company was founded to kill communists. And even if you say, he's making a hilarious joke there, I mean, I think it's still a pretty interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, they are what they are. A lot of people took Peter Thiel's like stuff about the millennials and Zoomers not trusting capitalism as like, he understands and he'll mitigate it with some right-wing populism. And I'm like, no, he's building a repressive apparatus, you fucking moron. Um, I think a lot of you are addicted to the very thing that spies on you. I mean, I am too, and we're on this right now. All this would be recorded and kept up. I do think one of the issues though is like none of these right now. A lot of the ties into the intelligence agency are also tied into keeping AI afloat, if we're quite honest. And that whole thing. And so there's tons of internal contradictions about what would happen here. But I do think Kuba's got a point about like what you would see. I mean, eventually, guys, the tactics that the neoconservatives perfected during the Bush years will be brought home. That's already how they're that's already language they're using. That's already how they're justifying this. We could talk about it as blowback. We can talk about it as the imperial boomerang. It's a little bit of all of it. But the idea that even some leftists pointed that since we're beyond neocons, that we're beyond all this now. No, we're not. Some people misinterpreted me saying, for example, that they're like Hadrian's walling the empire, as the empire is not going to be brutal. And that's probably going to be more brutal. Again, wounded bear. When people have this romantic notion about going and building stuff in your communities, and I'm not going to tell you not to do that. Like I'm a union organizer. I lived in places that have had the government completely collapse. These civic things are actually very, very important. And the least important thing you can do is probably go and get yourself symbolically arrested or thinking that if you go buy a Mauser that you'll be able to liberate the country. That's just delusional. But you do have to think about where you're at and how you deal with these security threats. And a lot of people in this country, and Kuba can probably speak to this, Gene can probably speak to this. We all grew up in, different levels of comfort, but relatively comfortable. I mean, even though I was pretty blue collar and kind of poor, it wasn't like I was living on the streets during a war zone. But you're going to need to rethink the way we think about who your neighbors are, because without those ties, and I'm not talking about going out and convincing Republican trolls on the internet to be socialists. Like that's a waste of your fucking time. But without those ties in your larger community, you don't have anything. The reason why you don't have a mass political response to most of this is because most people do not have mass political ties. Even the churches are deracinated. That's part of what people are responding to. That's part of why they identify with Dear Leader. So if you want to deal with that, you kind of have to deal with this on three fronts at once. Like, what do you do if the security threat happens? What do you do for your kind of public-facing political stuff and voting and bourgeois democracy and all that crap? And what do you do to reinvigorate your community to be able to resist all this? And it is not just a primarily protest. I'm not saying protests don't play a price. They build solidarity between people. They don't speak truth to power. Trust me, power already knows what the truth is, or they don't care. They probably don't care, actually, more than they know. But nonetheless, that's going to be your resilience right now. You're not trying to win the diehard Trumpers. You're trying to win the 5 to 10% of people who were just okay and voted for it anyway in 2024. And I'm not talking about, go vote and save democracy, because honestly, what it's going to take to rebuild democratic institutions in America is not just putting the Democrats back in office. And if you think I'm telling you that, you're not hearing what I'm saying. But things are going to continue to degenerate for a while. And if Trump continues his all-out assault on everything, because again, guys, I keep on mentioning this. This is happening in the context of like 80 other things happening at once. It will fragment a lot of the elites of this society too. A lot of people understand math in a way that a lot of these MAGA nationalists don't. And I don't mean that, I'm just talking about raw numbers and demographics here. And so you got to kind of have to look at this in a variety of ways. Because the other thing, if Kuba's right and counterintelligence is coming, most of y'all give most of your stuff away for free. You're like, tell us what to do on a podcast? On a podcast, not just because it's a podcast. Like, if I was to tell you, somebody asked me once why I don't talk about my organizing work more on my show. Why on earth would I make that public? Even though that's totally legal. You have to change what you think and how discreet you are. Most of you have not lived in a place where you can't say this stuff publicly without repercussion. And you shouldn't have to live in that place. It is not the culture of which we've been promised, but it might be the culture you're living in. And I'll turn it over to somebody else.
Speaking of culture, Gene, what culture are we living in? Are we living in the gambling porn culture?
I mean, this is actually a question I've often, been thinking about. So when these guys are out there saying you have to assimilate into American culture, I have no idea what they're talking about. Okay, the language bit I can get. Language has been a vector, a controversial one for nation building. Of course, we all know there were indigenous languages here before English was spoken. There's Pennsylvanian Dutch, which was here at the time of the American Revolution, and large parts of this country were part of the Spanish Empire as well. But okay, I get it. Everybody should learn English to participate in public life. Fine. Beyond that, I'm like, is it which Cisco slot food you eat on Thursday night at the identical chain restaurant? Is it your Pornhub account? Is it sports betting? Is it what are these things that we're being? Do you have to drive?
You've left out
Ford F-150. It's an interesting question precisely because of the things that Vaughn are talking about. Because a practical participation in a quote unquote nation or even a community requires some kind of civil society. But if you live in a society devoid of civil society, or where most civil society, like even with the church, you go to a church and it's just a kind of inferior version of generic American pop culture. They have like Christian rock songs, a light show, and Cirque du Soleil, and that's all it is. So the other problem is it's like you would assimilate, a gooning culture, exactly. You would, what are you being asked to assimilate it? There's like, it's not like you have all these like kind of I don't know, like it's like the Shriners are dying, or the Masons, or your local this thing or that. There are still like charity organizations and stuff like that, but it really feels that society is completely atomized, and because of that atomization, the question of the only people who seem to have communities are like those Haitians or the Somali community, ironically. Being like just a generic white American seems like very alienating, and I think that's partly why we're seeing this reactionary politics, because it's precisely amongst those communities that in general, like, atomization has progressed the greatest. Immigrant communities still have like some kind of organic ties that link them together, but it is what it is.
Is there anything you want to say in closing, Ben Burgess?
Well, I did see I did see there was some sort of discussion in the chat. I missed most of it about whether I was a centrist, which I'll take. I have, if I don't know, anarcho-syndicalism is on one side, and Stalinism is on the other. I'm in the sensible center. I have, common sense positions we could all agree with, like we should nationalize the means of production and put them under workers' control. But in any case, no, I think I'm good. I'm going to cross the border tomorrow, and I'm a little worried. We've talked a little bit too much in this episode about how bad the border patrol is. So if anybody's watching, that was these guys. That wasn't me. I don't talk like that about you fine gentlemen. And I'm very sorry.
Kuba.
The key is have a phone in both jurisdictions so you don't have to cross with one.
Yep.
There it is. That's the end.
Practically helpful. And after that, I don't know what more value I can give to this conversation. Right now, there's a balance that everyone has to find between minimizing risk to yourself and your loved ones, and trying to do what you can to slow the evolution of authoritarianism in uglier and uglier directions in the United States. I don't know how things will develop. I think it is heartening that other countries have begun taking this very seriously. We might see the West finally split between the United States and Europe, plus Canada, maybe Australia and New Zealand, into still capitalist, but potentially more hopeful and reasonable great power. And and even if it turns out that Germany is an appropriate analogy, don't forget that there's a difference between Germany in 1939 and 1936 and 1932, right? Potentially there's still an off-ramp and an opportunity to get out of this mess. I don't know what that looks like. And under normal circumstances, I would have a little bit more faith that people like Gavin Newsom, who clearly is not going to fare well if Trump is finally able to deploy repression against political rivals, that figures like that might take their authority seriously within the system to try to protect it from this threat. But we'll see. And until then, Drone Club.
Also, get a Faraday bag for your phone. For real, get a Faraday bag for your phone, even domestically.
Well, thank you guys for hanging out. Gene, thank you for making a quick return to the show.
Real bang you picked me for.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking, like, maybe you shouldn't.
I was like, what the fuck is this guy doing, man?
Gene's great. Gene's a foreigner.
Yeah.
Totally not an issue. Yeah, exactly, right now. Exactly. Who is my most vulnerable friend?
I mean, I thought we were going to talk about 80s girl bands, and then you bounced on this shit on me.
He's lying.
I was
because he saw the literal title of the show.
No, man, I did. I was just like chilling. I've been working all day, so
he saw it. Don't believe the hype.
No, I did think it was 80s girl band.
If you believe in Gene Bajlan right now, I have some land to sell you in Florida.
What land? There's no land left.
Thank you, guys. And we are out.